Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are coming from in the world. And welcome to this edition of PON Live. Today, the program on negotiation is delighted to present this event, an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, Opportunities and Challenges. My name is Nicole Bryant, and I am the Managing Director here at the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. The Program on Negotiation is a consortium of Harvard University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Tufts University. At PON, we work to help people solve problems, build successful relationships, and deal productively with conflict. And we're convinced that learning how to negotiate more effectively will help our learners and practitioners in their work, in their communities, and in their personal lives. And to that end, it is our great pleasure to bring together a series of events such as this one to our global community of scholars, practitioners, and friends. Today's participants come from all over the world. We are starting to see where you're coming from in the chat. You know, I love that part. Hello from Cambridge, Massachusetts. It is sunny and a little bit cold here. We hope to welcome you soon to campus, perhaps in the spring. This talk will be recorded. It will be posted on the PON website probably in about a week. Before I hand it off, I would like to thank the incredible PON staff, as ever, for their hard work planning and supporting this event today, and specifically Shula Gilad, Diane Long, and Anna Chang. Thank you, ladies, for all that you've done to get us here today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Professor Bob Mnookin, for this event. Bob is a renowned scholar and an instructor in the field of negotiation and dispute resolution. He is a professor at Harvard Law School and for many years was the faculty chair of the program on negotiation. Bob, the Zoom floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here. I think we have a real treat in store for you because we have assembled three people who have real expertise on confederations and the possible use of confederations to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I want to very briefly introduce our panel and then describe to you how we're going to proceed. Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin is a fellow at Century International, and while she's in New York now, she is normally based in Tel Aviv. She's a public opinion expert and an international political and strategic consultant. Indeed, she conducts extensive public opinion and policy research on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the peace process, and worked with Prime Minister Ehud Barak during the Camp David negotiations. Omar Rahman is a political analyst and journalist and commentator who concentrates on the Middle East and American foreign policy. He has a special focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he's a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, although he's in New York City today. Omar Dajani, like me, is a law professor. He's at the McGeorge School of Law at the University of Pacific, where he heads the Center for Business and Development. Educated at Northwestern and Yale Law School, he was the legal advisor to the negotiations support unit of the PLO for the Camp David negotiations. We're going to proceed as follows. I really have three sets of questions. Each set will initially be directed to one of our panelists, and the other two panelists will then briefly elaborate. We'll then rotate where the second set of questions will be put to a second panelist. After we've gone through the three sets of questions, we're going to take Q&A from you, our webinar audience. You'll see on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, Q&A. If you have a question for the panelists, please put it there, and I will do my best to use them during that part of the program. I want to begin with the first question, and that really goes to what is a confederation? What's it all about? A confederation has been defined as a governmental entity created by independent sovereign states that join together to perform some governmental functions under a common authority. Initially, Dahlia is going to describe to us what she would propose as the features of a confederation between an Israeli and Palestinian state. we're asking her what she sees as the advantages of such a confederation, and perhaps to describe in the world today where it has been used in the past. Dahlia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for hosting this webinar and for inviting me, and for the opportunity to try to make some clarity out of a field in which the terminology is often confused. The idea of a confederation, as you pointed out, does involve two separate independent sovereign states, as opposed to one unitary state with a central government. That would be a federation. So we're looking at two states. The border between them is approximately based on the Green Line, and I'm situating this right away in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But the major difference between a confederation with a border between them and a unitary state is that, or two separate states, is that we're looking at a porous border. It's an open border. That doesn't mean there's no border, but it is it facilitates movement with a border regime that essentially treats the two sides as individuals if there are security threats, not as a collective, which is what we have today, collective restrictions on one of the two people living between the river and the sea. So you have a border that facilitates freedom of movement and still defines the two territorial entities that are these states entering into an association. The idea is that people would be allowed to live as permanent residents on the other side, with their citizenship remaining according to the place of nationality. So you disconnect residency from citizenship. Again, this is not unlike the Schengen zone or the European Union, in which people can live on the other side or in another country even, but they have equal rights, but they vote in the country of their nationality. And the idea of this mechanism is to allow in order to try to break down the obstacles that have really plagued the negotiations over a two-state solution. And this mechanism of allowing people to live in the other country, but voting in their country of nationality, again, with full rights as equal residents, but citizenship in the country of their nationality, is intended to help find solutions for the issue of settlers, Israeli Jewish settlers who could live under a sovereign Palestinian state if they accept Palestinian sovereignty and if they're law-abiding, but they would vote in Israel. So they couldn't change the character of the national government in Palestine. And for Palestinian refugees from 1948 to recognize those who would have a right to return to Israel and live there as permanent residents, but with the right to exercise their national vote in Palestine. All of the details about how to do this, while they are essential to creating such an agreement, can be agreed upon between the two sides in a negotiation. So exactly how to implement this, what would be the phase of time, what is the security vetting? The point is those can be worked out in negotiations, but the conceptual mechanism is that people, refugees or settlers, could live on the other side and not be able to exercise their vote there, but in their country of nationality. This helps to preserve essentially what we're talking about as a state of Israel and a state of Palestine in terms of the voting public, the electoral body politic. In terms of Jerusalem, the concept is different because instead of dividing Jerusalem along the lines of a hard partition, which is what's envisioned in the two-state plans, the city remains open, shared, and accessible to all, of course, subject to security needs, which would be coordinated between the two sides. But essentially, you have a capital for both states in one city, which is a physical possibility. Israel already has its capital there. The Palestinians can establish a capital probably on the eastern side of the city with all the reasonable security measures needed, but also representation for the different communities in the municipal government, which doesn't exist today due to historic politics and many other limitations. The idea is that you have essentially two states with greater cooperation built in as an organic part of their relationship. So they share, again, to some extent, freedom of movement, freedom of residence, and they would share security, some sort of security cooperation, not under terms of occupation. Today we have security cooperation, but in an essentially very asymmetrical approach in which Israel dominates. Here you would have built in, the idea that two states are equal. This is a fundamental principle. And they would coordinate on security policy as well as a shared economic zone, cooperation on economic planning, which is essentially reflects the reality of today. The two sides are economically very intertwined, but again, in a situation of deep asymmetry. The idea is to cooperate and coordinate on an economic policy that helps to close or at least narrow those gaps. And the two sides can develop shared agencies for common policies as needed, such as environmental policies, climate crisis, resource management, and increasingly we all understand the need for epidemiological shared policy, health policy. So the idea is that you instead of developing a hard partition, you start with the perspective of two equal states who agree to share these kinds of powers. Now, I'm going to jump ahead very quickly and try to answer the question, or at least open up the question of where we can see other places where this has worked and at what phases in history. Let me start by saying most of the examples I'll run through very quickly don't necessarily use the term confederation or not anymore. And that's for, again, all sorts of historic reasons, but we can think about the fact that historically, both Canada and Switzerland began life as a confederation, at least in name, again, with different meanings to what this meant exactly. Switzerland in the Middle Ages, Canada from the 19th century, but they essentially evolved into federal systems, so more unitary states. The more important aspect from my perspective is that they both have become symbols of peaceful countries. Interesting just to consider that historic benchmark. And in recent times, I would say we have a couple of other examples that maybe are a little bit, so present that we don't always notice them, more or less successful. The European Union itself has a number of confederation-like qualities. Again, it doesn't use the term confederation, but it was established as a structure of independent states coming together to share certain sovereign powers with certain limitations on their sovereignty, with lots of complications. But it emerged out of the most catastrophic war in human history, I think we can agree, and has kept the peace for decades, despite all those complications. Another hybrid system, which essentially developed two entities that exist in a kind of, very, very careful and engineered power sharing arrangement, is Bosnia. And the Dayton Agreement was established in order to actually end the war between, ethno-national territorial groups. It's one of the most, I think, interesting cases, very, very troubled. There's a lot of dysfunction. And I don't want to say that, I don't want to whitewash this in any way. But the
Dahlia,
fact is,
excuse me, I'm afraid we're going to now move on. Thank
Okay.
you for at least introducing very well the core concept and beginning to give some examples. I now want to give 3 minutes to Omar Rahman to elaborate on any dimensions of this first question.
Can we start with Omar Dajani, if you don't mind? I think he could jump in really and add to that, because Dahlia did an excellent job of laying the foundations that I don't have a ton to add, unless you want to ask me a question that I can follow up on.
No, well, that's fine. Omar Dajani, why don't you elaborate? Unmute yourself.
You would think that after a year spent on Zoom, that I wouldn't need to be told to unmute myself. Hello, everyone, and thanks so much, Dahlia, for your introductory remarks, and to the organizers for this really fantastic for organizing this session. I think Dahlia covered a lot of the really key attributes of Confederation. There is just one piece of the puzzle that I think it's useful for us to address right off the bat, and that is that Confederation hasn't often in the past been used as a framework for resolving identity conflict. In the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, increasingly in relation to Cyprus, to some extent in Yemen, it has emerged as an idea, and it's useful to ask, why now? What makes Confederation suddenly appealing? And I think that what helps to explain the appeal of Confederation in this moment as a structure is that it permits within a territorial space the maximum degree of self-determination for each of the peoples that resides within that space. And so if we think about different political institutions along a continuum, we can imagine a fully unitary state as one in which, and when I say unitary state, I'm contrasting that with a federal state like the one that we have here in the United States. In a unitary state, we can think of the citizen as the main building block of the state. As we move along a continuum, we can imagine institutions being increasingly tailored to represent peoples within the state. What's interesting about confederation is that it provides an opportunity for each of the units within it to go further toward attending to the needs, the ambitions, the interests of the people that are represented within the Confederation.
Thank you. In other words, what I hear you saying is that a confederation allows the economy to be integrated, allows a great deal of freedom to travel and where one wants to be residents, but it still permits the creation of a sovereign state that can be organized around the needs of a people. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely.
Do you also want to add anything additional about examples of confederations? Dahlia indicated that historically that there were roots both in Canada, Switzerland, and that today perhaps the Dayton Accord, in terms of what it's done in Bosnia, has created something that's akin to a federation in some respects. Are there any other examples you think we should have in mind?
Sure. So in terms of examples that are continuing today, the numbers are small. The European Union is a hybrid between a confederation and a federation. It has some confederal features. And we see that in the fact that we can still think of France and Germany and Spain being independent states, having independent foreign policies, having some independent government policy-making space with respect to an array of issues, even though integration has moved at pace. We can also think fairly recently to a confederation that existed briefly, ephemerally, which was the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro, with which Dahlia is very familiar. And there what we had was something closer to what we are imagining for Israel and Palestine, where two groups that understood themselves as distinct ethnically, Serbians and Montenegrins, each had a almost sovereign state within the framework of the state union. But they continued to share a range of state institutions. Now, what's interesting about that model is that it was understood by many to be a transitional model, that it served as kind of a way station in between the previous federation that had existed in Yugoslavia and independence for Montenegro from Serbia. And in that respect, it was the closest thing that we've got to confederation as a framework for managing identity conflict. Dahlia, did you want to add anything about that?
I would like to briefly say that just in the case of both the EU and Serbia Montenegro, what we see is, by contrast to those that kind of came together, as Omar and I have discussed in work that we've done, these two came apart in ways that symbolized a sort of rejection of the relationship, but without any violence. And I think that the flexibility to change the nature of the constitutional arrangement without resorting to violence is key to the situation we're talking about, where it is hopefully being implemented with conflict resolution in mind.
Thank you. And Brexit is another example of exit as well for the EU. I want to now turn to the second set of questions. And Omar Rahman is going to be our principal speaker for this. And I guess my question to you, Omar, is, are you supporting a confederation because you believe it is superior to a two-state resolution along the so-called Clinton parameters, or instead because you believe a two-state resolution is no longer feasible and that confederation is more feasible to negotiate and implement? In either case, I'd love you to explain why.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me and to speak on this very important panel, and to my colleagues both for unpacking, doing the heavy lifting on that first question and unpacking that. I could also jump in on a few of those things, but just to answer your question, I think the short answer is both. I think it is superior as an applied concept in Israel-Palestine to the traditional two-state framework. You know, it addresses needs and aspirations in ways that strict partition cannot. it mitigates or even overcomes in some cases zero-sum competition in ways that strict partition cannot. And one example of that would be borders, for example. Anytime you're drawing a border, you're essentially creating winners and losers. And you might be creating losers on both sides in terms of their access. And that's especially true when you have a severe power imbalance at the negotiating table, as we do when it comes to this conflict. So the powerful side never really wants to relinquish their access to the other side of where a prospective boundary would be drawn. But by offering rights in the same way Dahlia mentioned earlier to citizens beyond the border that are facilitated by shared institutions and mechanisms, let's say through the system of permanent residency, you're mitigating that inherent border problem. Citizens are not losing access, they're not losing the right to live, work, and worship on the other side. And that doesn't, of course, make the border inconsequential, but it makes it less of a sticking point when you're talking about negotiations. And I think you can apply a similar rationale, a similar logic to each of the final status issues that have come up in terms of negotiations on Jerusalem, refugees, settlements. And I think in any of those cases, this type of integrative approach allows you to overcome obstacles in ways that strict partition does not, even on an issue like security. And although I think many would argue with that claim because confederalism forces the sides to compromise or cooperate on their security in ways that they might be uncomfortable with. But one of the problems with security in a strict partition scenario is that each state is ultimately trusting the other side to be peaceful beyond their own deterrence capabilities, of course. But that becomes risky and problematic, especially when compared to the current situation for Israel, which is in total control. And because of that inherent risk, Israel has used the security dilemma as a rationale for not ending the occupation and for preventing the Palestinians from having their own state. They can say they cannot trust an independent Palestinian state, not to become hostile or a bastion for terrorists from the wider region in the long term. And so that, if your appetite for risk is zero, well, then you're never going to get anywhere, essentially. On the other hand, if you have a hand in the other side's security, if you have a say on issues like immigration and oversight of it, then I think those dynamics change. And as long as there's parity in that relationship, then it becomes less of an intrusion in the weaker side's sovereignty. Confederalism also, I think, contends or accounts for the history of this conflict in a way that the Oslo process and the Clinton parameters dispensed with. And I think that's important when we're seeking to accommodate the attachment of these peoples to the entirety of Israel-Palestine. I think it's essential when we talk about the refugees, because you can try and accommodate realities through political pragmatism, but you can't ignore them entirely. And I think that is a recipe for failure. It galvanizes opposition, it creates spoilers, and I think we saw that play out in real life in the two-state approach. So I think confederalism helps attenuate many sticking points. It also expands what's on offer to both peoples than the traditional two-state framework, and that's important. Again, through allowing access to both sides, you're expanding rights. I don't want to oversell confederalism. I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think it's worthy of consideration and deeper reflection and research. Now to the second part of your question. I also believe that a traditional two-state framework is no longer feasible, and that we have to, at least at this point, start exploring alternatives that could be implemented potentially down the road. And it's not just the physical impediment of 200 plus settlements in the occupied territories or uprooting hundreds of thousands of settlers. The political dynamics in Israel today make it virtually impossible to carry out the type of action or undertaking that's needed to bring about two states. First of all, you have the Netanyahus and the Naftali Bennetts who have really no ideological interest in doing so. But even if somebody like Yair Lapid, who's in line to become the next prime minister, eventually takes office, I don't think he could take a single step in the direction of two states without the governing coalition collapsing. There's also a basic law in place that requires a supermajority of 80 Knesset members for Israel to retreat from 1 inch of territory. So there are many vested interests in the status quo, and to take steps towards two-state, I think would kind of spark a real upheaval in Israeli society. So I don't think it's going to happen. But also in Palestinian politics, the situation is very dire. It's far from ideal for negotiating any kind of settlement and having it stick in terms of the legitimacy of the current leadership and the current institutions. So at present, I don't think any negotiated framework is possible until the internal political dynamics for both societies change, as well as the broader geopolitical dynamics. But that's not a call for apathy, I think, as some people are interpreting it. As in, this conflict can't be solved, so let's basically do nothing. Let's facilitate some minor confidence building measures that have little impact. Let's shrink the conflict, which is its own bag of worms. What I'm saying is actually, essentially a call to action in terms of shifting the dynamics and shifting our thinking, because the cost benefit calculus being made in which the current situation is better than a resolution of conflict ultimately needs to change. And again, that begins at least for us in this sort of setting or among policymakers internationally with perceiving the reality on the ground with clear eyes. And I think it's nearly impossible not to recognize what has emerged on the ground. There's no longer a temporary occupation. This thing is 54 years and running with an entrenched colonial project attached to it. And there today is no pretense of withdrawing or negotiating a peaceful solution. It's explicitly said by the political leadership in Israel today that there will be no Palestinian state. So the only thing you can kind of foresee Israel being willing to negotiate in the future is something that resembles the Trump peace plan. Because in fact, I think that's an accurate representation of the reality that has been imposed on the ground today with the 167 non-contiguous ghettoized enclaves on the Palestinian side that resemble the Bantustans of apartheid South Africa. So remaining wedded to a policy framework of two states that was developed decades ago, I think makes little sense, and it's really detached from the reality on the ground, especially when you're expecting to get there through the same vehicle that was used in the past, bilateral negotiations, which have already failed time again. So being stuck in this framework, I think, is a mistake. And I think we have to kind of evolve in our thinking of where we want to go and how we plan on getting there. And I think that's where Confederation can come in. Because
thank you so much. I think that you've done a great job of explaining both why you prefer it to a two-state resolution and how it addresses the issues in the Clinton parameters that have been very difficult to negotiate. Omar Dajani, how about some comments?
Sorry about that. I keep on struggling with the Zoom framework. So I agree entirely with what my fellow Omar has had to say about the appeal of Confederation over a two-state solution. And I agree both that it is increasingly difficult to implement a classic two-state solution, the kind of thing that was envisaged during the Oslo Accords, and that such a solution is not very responsive to the interests of either Palestinians or Israelis in the long run. Having said that, I think it's also important to bear in mind that implementing a confederation presents challenges of its own. And Omar signaled that this was so during his remarks, but during the work that Dahlia and I have done together, exploring the challenges presented to creating a confederation, to our mind, beyond the difficulties associated with actually implementing it, difficulties, for example, with ensuring that on the one hand, you can achieve security across the full space of Israel-Palestine, and on the other hand, that each of the states would retain a measure of control over questions of citizenship, over questions about who crosses the border. Balancing those issues against each other, as just one example, is incredibly difficult. But in addition to challenges associated with implementing a confederation, What we also struggled with was the challenges associated with getting to one. And here, one of the primary impediments to implementing the kind of two-state solution that President Clinton was advocating, as Omar said, has been political will within Israel. And on this front as well, I think Confederation presents serious challenges. Israelis are not yet at a place where they understand there to be a real cost associated with maintaining the status quo, which is a de facto one-state reality in which Israel holds all of the reins of authority with respect to an array of questions that determine what Palestinians' lives look like. And so I think whether we're talking about a two-state solution of the old type or a confederal two-state solution, we still have to confront the question of how do we persuade Israel and Israelis to move in this direction? And
I think that's a great, a very important point to emphasize. And Dahlia, is there anything you'd like to add on this question?
Sure. Thank you. Just to pick up on the point. No. Okay. Now, just to pick up on the point that it's been very, I mean, one of the reasons why I think I became more interested in looking for alternative approaches in general is that, 21 years, or let's say not all of those 21 years were negotiations, but since essentially the Camp David negotiations in the year 2000, the sides have not managed to agree on a two-state solution, and it's not for lack of trying. You can blame the political figures involved or the public on both sides, but we really have to acknowledge that there may have been something wrong with the destination for where they were going. And I think one of the advantages to this is that it tries to create a destination that is more, relevant, more feasible, more optimistic. I think this isn't, we're talking about this, considering this as a policy approach, writing about it, researching it. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there's something fundamentally more livable about an approach that doesn't barricade the two sides into their separate corners, lock the wall and throw away the key, but actually creates a vision that is somewhat more hopeful and I think more realistic for how to live. Those challenges, by the way, the two-state solution on the Israeli side, I can speak, with great depth, and to some extent on the Palestinian side too, about the reasons why the negotiations have failed. I also know we have some negotiations experts on this call, including our panelists, but other people in the audience. The issue of Palestinian refugees and the division of Jerusalem were the two biggest sticking points at most points during the negotiations. Certainly that's the case within the Israeli public. Those are the issues where you have the most resistance. And so why would Israelis change their mind about this kind of approach? I think because they're being offered a different way of looking at those. Jerusalem does not get divided. And by the way, that's something that Palestinians and Israelis at this point in our survey research, this joint survey research that I conduct with my colleague Khalil Shikaki, the exact same number of Israelis and Palestinians support the division of Jerusalem, and it's very few. It's barely over 20%. The vast majority on both sides oppose it. So this is more reflective, at least, of what the two sides want. The issue of—
Dahlia, forgive me, but we got to move on to our third question now.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
The point remains for some of those other obstacles is what I'm saying. This opens up some of the major obstacles that existed to negotiations.
Exactly. Well, the third question, which is initially directed to Omar Dajani, is as follows. Do you support a confederation because you believe it is a superior resolution when compared to a single secular democratic state with equal rights for all citizens? Or do you believe that such a single state resolution, a single secular state with equal rights, is politically impossible and that a confederation is more feasible? If a confederation is also not yet politically feasible, are there interim steps that might be taken relating to the creation of shared institutions that will reduce the conflict and improve the lives of people? All of this in 7 minutes.
I'll do my best. So I should start off by saying that I used to be a believer in a one-state solution. Ironically, at the time when I arrived in Palestine in 1999, to provide support to negotiations for a two-state solution, I remained a fervent supporter of a one-state solution. It seemed to me then that establishing a single democratic state across all of Palestine and Israel had three primary virtues. First, it preserved the integrity of the land. It honored the attachment of Palestinians and Israelis to all of that territory. It wouldn't oblige me, for example, to forswear my connection to Jaffa, where my family had lived for generations, nor would it require a religious Jew to give up living in the shadow of the tomb of patriarchs in Hebron. Second, it permitted me to imagine a political community built around a concept of citizenship that was familiar to me as an American, a concept premised, at least in principle, on equal rights, on blindness to religion and ethnicity, at least with respect to the allocation of rights. And third, I imagined that both of those features, the indivisibility of the land and equal citizenship, made a one-state solution the approach that was most compatible with the idea of Palestinian refugee return. So this was where I was 22 years ago. My position around these questions shifted during the time I was working on the peace process. I came to embrace a two-state solution, but to be frank, it was more a function of pragmatism than conviction, the way Democrats embraced Obamacare, I guess. I never fell in love with the idea of partition of the land into two states for two peoples, which seemed both illiberal and somehow ahistorical. To your question, Bob, I have fallen in love with the idea of confederation. And though it seems to me that attempting to implement a one-state solution is not only incredibly difficult, but also may make it harder to achieve some of the kinds of things that I earlier identified as being critically important, things like refugee return. My primary reasons for believing in confederation have less to do with the infeasibility of a one-state solution and more to do with what confederation allows. So as Omar Rahman indicated previously, confederation, like a one-state solution, enables us to think of the territory of Israel-Palestine as indivisible, as one space within which there is freedom of movement for Palestinians and Israelis, and ultimately freedom of residence for Palestinians, Israelis across that space. So it's got that attribute like a one-state solution. But what it provides that a one-state solution doesn't is a far greater measure of self-determination for each of the peoples in that space. And it's important, I think, to think of self-determination not just as an esoteric concept, but as a bundle of practical rights. It has the potential for Palestinians to offer not only an end to military occupation, but also the opportunity to craft an independent foreign policy, one that is shaped by Palestinians' distinct economic needs and cultural and political affinities. Palestinians would have greater latitude in a state of our own to determine how and what our children are taught, which languages they speak, which holidays they celebrate, which history they commemorate. And these are the kinds of rights that minorities across the globe continue to struggle for. To be sure, many of these things can be achieved through the framework of minority rights within a single state. But minority rights, it has to be recognized, have always been a consolation prize rather than a goal in and of themselves for communities seeking self-determination. And I think that a second thing that a confederation offers, and to a far greater extent than a one-state solution, is the possibility of ensuring, by virtue of reciprocity, that in a circumstance where there is a Palestinian state with a Jewish minority residing within it and an Israeli state with a Palestinian minority residing within it, that each of those states will be mindful of the rights of their own kin in living as a minority in the other when determining how to treat folks within their own jurisdiction. And I think reciprocity of that kind can provide a powerful framework for ensuring positive treatment within each of those states, and maybe help move us toward a less ethnic, more liberal conception of citizenship on both sides of the Green Line. Now, as we were discussing earlier, I think achieving a confederation is incredibly difficult, presents real challenges. Let me just say a few words about how we might move towards it in the moment that we're in right now.
If you could do it in about a minute, that would be great.
Okay, sure. Sorry, I'll be as quick as I can. It seems to me that two areas that are worth exploring immediately are Jerusalem and health and social welfare benefits. Jerusalem is already a space in which Palestinians and Israelis live together, and one in which it seems to me it makes sense for Palestinians to engage politically, to move beyond the decision to reject participation in Jerusalem municipal life and to participate with a view toward transforming their lives and providing proof and concept. Secondly, I think, as Sari Bashi has elaborated in some of her work, there's a lot of room for pressing for the extension of Israeli health and social welfare benefits to Palestinians in the occupied territory. I'll stop there and we can talk more.
Well, those are both also interesting examples of how piecemeal one could proceed to start elements of integration that would be consistent with the confederated arrangement later. What I'd like to do, given the time constraints, is now turn to a few of the questions that have been asked. And one question is as follows. If the parties who have so far been negotiating have failed, who will be the parties to negotiate a confederation of sovereign states? What stakeholders within each community, Dahlia, do you see as being supportive of this kind of enterprise?
One of the reasons why this is a new kind of approach in terms of the potential for reaching an agreement is because it does accept that there are figures who have been in the past considered to be spoilers who can be brought in because it offers some concessions. And I'm talking specifically about the Israeli Jewish settler community, which is controversial. But the fact is that these are among the hardest line rejectionists of a two-state solution. And this approach offers them a different way of choosing their own fate. They may not see it as a victory because many of them would prefer to stay under Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank. But it does offer them a choice and a say and recognizes their connection to the region. So I'm not saying they're going to take the lead on this, but there is a reason why a number of, well, I should say certain specific people within the settler community have expressed particular kinds of interest in this. They see it as more of an acknowledgement that they belong inside a process to reach a solution and can help dismantle some of the widespread opposition. On the Palestinian side, I'll let my colleagues weigh in, but I do think that for the reasons that both of you mentioned, there are people who on the Palestinian side would have been committed to a single state, but who see this as a version of sort of opening up the possibilities, combining some of the best elements of a single state, as well as the two-state, the recognition that there are two different sides. The last thing I'll say before handing it to my colleagues is because I think that to negotiate any sort of agreement, there's no question that both sides need legitimate leadership. You can't expect, this has been an impressive grassroots effort so far. And we should mention that there is a group on the ground called Land for All, started out being called Two States, One Homeland, who've been doing a lot of work in getting the word out about this. grassroots has been very important for putting this idea, getting this idea into the discussion. But of course, elected representative leadership will be key in legitimizing and ultimately negotiating the kinds of compromises and agreement that will need to be made. To that end, another way of getting there eventually, since we're talking about the stage of both reaching an agreement and then implementing it, is to have these ideas become part of the policy discourse in Israel at the level of parties and leadership. And we may have some, at least some sort of opportunity with the new government. And on the Palestinian side, making sure there is a representative leadership, which I think is very urgent. And I think that, again, I'll let my colleagues expand on this, but no question that this has to come from grassroots, include some of the traditional spoilers, which we see in other peace processes around the world. They really can't be left out entirely. You don't want to have a peace process be hostage to them, but they have to be brought in and also have top level leadership to be able to represent the people and negotiate this.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please, Omar.
I agree that there only has been movement right now or traction right now at the grassroots level. And that's important because you have to essentially build that to create any kind of momentum. But I don't think that's going to ultimately go very far, again, under current dynamics, because I don't think ultimately Israelis, the bulk of Israelis, are going to voluntarily dismantle what they have for some leap into the unknown. And that's where the cost benefit analysis that all Israelis, but especially Israeli politicians, will ultimately have to make. And so you have to change that dynamic, that cost benefit calculus, before you'll see any kind of movement. And I don't think, again, that confederation, although it sounds better than two states, is going to be better than the status quo for the majority of Israelis. But it might be the second option. It might be something because it addresses the needs of all these people, the aspirations of all these people, because it disarms spoilers, like Dahlia said, settlers and stuff like that, to a degree. I think if there is enough pressure built up, then, well, enough people can say, well, this is a viable option. We're willing to go for that. But until that happens, and that hasn't been the case for the negotiations around two states, except immediately after the first Intifada, I don't think we're ever going to have a situation in which you can negotiate any kind of framework. It needs to change in that regard. Go ahead, Omar.
One more. Let me put an additional question on the table because I want to have time for at least 2 or 3 questions, and that really has to do with refugees. If under a confederated state, millions of Palestinians emigrate in terms of residency to Israel, they of course would be citizens, presumably, of the new Palestinian state. But nonetheless, many might choose to reside within what is now territorially Israel and what would be territorially Israel. In terms of the politics of implementation, do you think this really would make implementation impossible?
I think that what no one imagines is a peace agreement in which Palestinians and Israelis shake hands, and then over the following year, 5 million Palestinian refugees move back to Israel. I think that in order for refugee return and resettlement to work, it has to be implemented through a very deliberate process, one that is attentive to refugees' needs, one that builds upon what social science research has taught us about how resettling communities best integrate with the communities where they arrive. And I think that it may be the case that initially residents in a Palestinian state will be desirable for many of those returning refugees. So I think that imagining the scale of millions all at one time makes this seem like a difficult prospect. But I think that what Confederation offers is the opportunity for us to think beyond just the question of refugee, non-refugee, to thinking about Israel and Palestine as a single territorial unit, and thinking about how residency and citizenship can be linked in some ways that make sense and delinked in others that make sense. A last point on this front is that one of the more interesting studies to explore these questions, which was done by IPCRI, Israeli-Palestinian Creative Regional Initiatives, explores to what extent political decentralization provides a means of ensuring that permanent resident communities in Israel and in Palestine are not underrepresented. What they suggest is by empowering localities more, municipalities, provincial and regional governments to respond to the needs of the people living within them, reducing the stakes of what happens in capitals could be one way of ensuring that refugee communities, for example, even if they're not citizens of the state of Israel, get proper representation in their communities.
That's very helpful. Dahlia, would you add anything to that?
Just one thing is, again, as we're looking at other societies, you mentioned earlier Cyprus. Now, Cyprus is not looking at a confederation model yet. The mainstream proposals for Cyprus have been a federation, but since those have failed over the years, there has been talk about a confederated-like solution. And on the issue of refugees, I will point out that in the plans that had been discussed for years, there was something that I feel very mixed about, but the idea that people from, refugees who had come from, who were Greek Cypriots who had left in 1974 living in the South would have a right to go back and vice versa, but they would be carefully kind of phased over time and with a certain ceiling. And I feel very mixed about this because there's something inherently troubling to me about demographic engineering. I personally may not like it, but it also may reflect the reality that we're trying to balance of having two sides that want to maintain, a particular character, and the combination of phased over time, vetting for security purposes on both sides, by the way, as well as a certain understanding that there needs to be a predominance of one group over the other, population-wise, may be something that can be negotiated. Again, I have very mixed feelings about it myself because the idea of this engineering is troubling, but it is something that has been proposed in other parts of the world that we can consider.
I guess another question, Omar Rahman, goes to security and the difficulty of coordinating security between two sovereign states. As we all know, in terms of negotiating a two-state resolution, Israel has put enormous emphasis on its security needs in terms of those negotiations. What do you see as the prospects that there could be agreement between two sovereign states about the security issues?
Yeah, security is an interesting one, and obviously I chose to jump in there at my own risk during my initial comments. But first of all, in my paper on Confederation, what I chose to do was, number one, utilize a lot of the in-depth work by security experts that's been done on this issue. Now, two major studies were done. One by General John Allen as part of the Obama administration. That one's classified, that looked into this in terms of getting as many Israeli generals and the top echelon of the security establishment to agree to what a security arrangement would look like between two independent states. And from what I understand, and I've spoken to principals of these various studies, they got very far. I mean, it was the political leadership and Netanyahu in particular that kind of X'd this in the end. But in terms of the security establishment, they got pretty far in drawing that up. Now, there is a public study that was done based on General Allen's study by the Center for New American Security that did this as well. So I relied on those two things. And then in speaking with the principals, went through and tried to understand how this would be applied to a confederate format. And I got from an understanding that a lot of these concepts in terms of security would actually be enhanced by a security arrangement between two states that are ultimately working together in a way that two independent states ultimately would not be. And there's a security sovereignty dilemma when it comes to the Israelis and the Palestinians, in which Israel does not ever want to give up control, and it impinges completely on Palestinian sovereignty. And so you have that kind of dilemma. I think there are ways in terms of confederation of breaking free of that. And I get into that in depth in the paper, or in some depth in the paper. But you can't look at security in terms of just this dynamic. You have to see Palestinian security, especially Palestinian human security, and you have to take the whole concept of security holistically when you look at that. And I really believe it makes a lot of sense, and it works for both parties, ultimately speaking. And there are, again, examples of that out there in terms of how Ireland and the UK relate to each other, how immigration and travel is done between those two sides, and how they coordinate on those kind of things, and allowing people. Anyway, I don't want to drone on in depth, but I think there are workable solutions for security that have been done.
Thank you. And I want to just underscore once again that for all of the viewers of our webinar, in the chat at 12:04, if you scroll up in the chat function, you'll see citations to the wonderful articles that our panelists write. And for those of you who want to pursue this further, I urge you to copy those. If afterwards you want to email me, I'd be glad to send them to you too. I'm mnookin@law.harvard.edu. In the last 3 minutes, I'd like to give each of you a minute for any closing observations or comments. Why don't we start with you, Omar Dajani?
Thanks very much. I'd like to come back to a point that Dahlia made earlier and to stress it, which is that what Confederation offers is more than a set of policy solutions. It offers something that we can all dream about. For a long time, what we've had to do is choose between self-determination on the one hand and the idea of living together in this land, Israel-Palestine, across the space of in an indivisible territory. And I think Confederation allows us, notwithstanding the many challenges it presents, to think about joining these two dreams together, of achieving something better than a set of petty nationalisms at war, and also better than a democratic state in which two peoples are locked in endless conflict for numerical supremacy. So I hope that we continue to find space to merge policy and dreams as we go forward.
Wonderful. Dahlia?
Great. I'd like to pick up on the point that my colleague Omar Dajani made, which is something about my evolving attitudes towards the old two-state solution, which I used to see as the pinnacle of success for peacemaking when I first became involved in these activities in the 90s and in the 2000s. And I think that what happened was, not only did I come to see that as fundamentally unfeasible at the practical level for geopolitical reasons we've all talked about, but it occurred to me over the years that it is illiberal in the sense that it essentially is predicated on the idea of ethnic segregation. And it is a vision in which the fundamental presumption is that people who are different in terms of their ethno-national religious backgrounds cannot live together, which is really antithetical to what I see as the greatest human sustainability and desirability for society. And so I think that it's not, I don't want to pretend that the two-state solution is completely gone, but I just think that it's not really a healthy way of looking at it. You're ultimately, I feel like the end point of a two-state solution is ethnic segregation. What does that mean for Palestinian citizens who will remain citizens of Israel? What does that mean for any Jewish minority living on the Palestinian side? And so that's one of the reasons why I came to move away from that approach conceptually. And the last thing I will say back to the pragmatic and policy level is that, as all of my colleagues have pointed out, there are many problems with reaching this and implementing this approach, and I don't want to diminish any of them. This is not to be glib, but if you look at the two-state solution as it has been envisioned in the past, there are, to my mind, not only no less problems, but profoundly more disruptive and possibly friction-producing and violence-producing problems at every level, at the security level, at the economic level, at the level of disruption of people's lives. And so I think that we really have to understand that policy problems will always be there. The question is, what's the endpoint? And I think this one has proven, to my mind, to be better the more I research it.
I'm going to quickly echo a couple sentiments, and then I want to say something a little bit new. One, again, I agree with Omar in terms of you have to be aspirational here. It can't be just practical, what's viable. You have to, again, appeal to people's senses of what they want for the future. I think that's really important. And that's why I tried to frame this, my paper at least, as a state plus framework, because it's about extending rights beyond the typical notions of two independent states. I share the sentiments that Omar said about why he supported one state in the past. And also I share the sentiments of why he came to appreciate the merits of confederation. But when it comes to one state, one of the things I wanted to say is that I find it very difficult to conceive of creating a civic national identity for these two peoples in the immediate term, maybe at some point in the future, but in the immediate term, I see a lot of problems with that and in envisioning a post-conflict polity that's going to survive and work in a one-state format. That's one thing. The second thing is, I don't see how you can implement one state. I don't see how you get there in terms of getting Israelis to agree. And I think it's really problematic. I think if you get into my paper a little bit, I can really explain that. And last thing, I think confederation has the potential to evolve. We've talked about already confederations that have existed prior, evolving into something else, maybe a federation down the road, maybe a one state, single national state down the road, or maybe coming apart into two states if it's not working. But it has the potential to evolve into one state. But I think you have to take a measure of allowing for self-determination now in the here and now for these two peoples because they want it. Again, Palestinians are really suffering, and so maybe they're willing to forgo that for rights, but it's something that they desire, and also achieving rights and liberty and freedom and everything else that can be involved in two states within this particular structure.
Well, thank you so much. Alas, our time is up. I'm going to leave the last word to Nicole Bryant, but I just want to very much thank our marvelous panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
And I will echo that. I can do nothing but thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thank you to you, Bob, for doing such a great job moderating. And just as a final note, as we always do, wanted to let you know that we do have a number of upcoming events which are posted on the PON website, and also a series of virtual one-day programs that are now or soon to be open for registration coming up in the spring. So if you've enjoyed engaging with PON, we'd love to see you in a longer format, as well as, of course, all of our courses, which are launching now for spring registration, including some programs that will be coming back in person for May and June. So we are looking forward to seeing you in this space or on campus. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thanks again to all of our panelists and to Professor Mnookin, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye, everyone.